Okay. All right. Just a couple of remarks. KSAN was not the first free-form progressive rock station in the country. There were others before, including KMPX here in San Francisco. Tom Donahue. A strike, the first hippie labor strike, as the Chronicle put it, led to the birth of KSAN in May 1968. Another myth is that Tom Donahue started it all. He did not. It is true that the former KYA Top 40 DJ, along with his girlfriend at the time, Rachel Hamilton, thought it'd be great to have a radio station that reflected and catered to the counterculture of the times. We're talking about 1966, 67. And they found a willing taker at KMPX, a very sorry station. But it is also true that there already was a DJ there playing whatever the hell he wanted, Larry Miller. But Tom Big Daddy Donahue is the man who spread the format, not only at KMPX, but also to a station in Los Angeles. After the strike, and after moving many of the staff over to KSAN, it became a dominant station in the Bay Area, passing by institutions like KSFO and top 40 powerhouses like KFRC, and yeah, Tom Donahue's previous station, KYA. The JIVE 95, as it came to be known, went on until 1980, when corporate changes begat format changes, and KSAN became a country station for a long spell. Then a classic rock station, which it still is, with the branding The Bone. It also lost its dial position, is now at 107.7, not far from where KMPX used to be. For this panel, we have 6 people who span the station's histories. There they are, sitting there. Dusty Street. She precedes KSAN. She was at KMPX as one of the fabled chick engineers. Beginning in 1967. They got to go on the air, but after the strike and the switch to KSAN, the engineers were out. But Dusty ran the board for a DJ who couldn't quite handle the board himself, and got an on-air shift when another DJ was fired. She left in 1974, but has never left radio. She was on KSFX, KTIM in Marin, then KROQ, K-Rock in Los Angeles, and she is online and freeform to this very day. Wesley Scoop Nisker. Joined KSAN in 1968 and became news director that year. Did his revolutionary audio collages and commentaries on and off until 1979. He was a regular on KFOG in the 80s, ranging from news director to occasional commentator. By then he was what he calls a professional Buddhist, teaching meditation, writing books, including the best-selling Essential Crazy Wisdom. He has 2 albums out. He performs a monologue called How to Be an Earthling. Scoop Nisker. Yeah. Richard Gossett. Yeah. He believes that he started as a part-timer on KSAN in 1969 and then got Tony Pigg's full-time shift when he left in 1970 or 71. He left after David Moorhead, who was shipped in from Metromedia in Los Angeles, took over in 1978.
El Nuclear Warhead.
He moved on to KSFX, did Saturday nights on the Quake, the original Quake, KQAK, for 2 years, and he would add KBRE, KFOG, and other stations to his resume. He had become by then a connoisseur of beer, and in '81 joined Anchor Brewery, becoming a brewmaster in 1983 until he retired in 2001. Bonnie Simmons. She came down from Denver in 1968, found her way to KSAN in 1970, beginning in the music library, becoming a DJ, music director, and program director. After leaving in 1979, she worked in promotion at Warner Brothers, appeared on numerous stations, including KFOG, Coffee, Live 105, KUSF, and KDBK. Remember double 99.
Oh my God, I forgot about it.
Yeah. Might have been a triple. She was also a band manager, currently serves as the executive director for the Bill Graham Foundation, and for 23 years has DJ'd Thursday evenings on KPFA. Still Bonnie, still Freeform. Yeah. Norman Davis is here. He got to KSAN in 1972 with more experience in radio than anyone else, except maybe Tom Donahue. He began locally on Colby in 1950. Colby, wow. In 1958, he was Al Knight on Colby. He landed at KYA as Lucky Logan, and then switched to his real name, Norman. At KSAN, he was a DJ and then production director until he left or was fired in 1978. He moved on to KSJO, KTIM, KTIM, The City, and Coffee. He has hosted blues shows in 10 states. The Midnight Flyer is on 2 stations, and the internet right now. And he is our heroic keeper of the KSAN archives at JIVE95.com. Norman! Terry McGovern! Oprah Winfrey here. McGovern! Arrived in 1974 at KSAN. It was a case of 2 different worlds, as he had come from KSFO. But he learned to rock and did mornings until 1979, when he returned to his careers as an actor and a voice talent, with credits ranging from American Graffiti to Mrs. Doubtfire and many more credits. Residual checks. But Terry began in 1965 on KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was on the air, on TV, and radio whenever he could be, in Los Angeles and here on K101, KYA, and now, along with Rachel Donahue and me, online on bossradio.com.
BossRadio.com.
As for, and there's an app for that, by the way. As for me, I did 10 years of weekends and fill-in work beginning in 1970, mostly Sunday afternoons, while also working full-time at some magazine. I stayed until the LA invasion, and since then had stints on KFOG, KQED, KUSF, with the JIVE radio series that I was able to co-produce with Kate Ingram, Moonlight Groove Highway with Rachel and Dusty, Classic KYA, Gary Mora, KFRC at 106.9, and now Boss Radio. Sunday afternoons, so it comes full circle. I also write a column in the Chronicle all about radio and mostly bad news. But today, we go back to the beginning of KSAN, and at least half of our panel was there. So, Dusty, Scoop, and Richard, these questions, or this first question, I think is for you about the beginning of KSAN. 10 years after the Summer of Love, KSAN did it must have been a week-long or a month-long special called What Was That? So that is my first question. What was it, this formless form of radio that sprang from the underground? Let's go to one of our chick engineers on the panel.
Great. Thanks so much. Chick engineers indeed. I got a lot of grief for that as well. Somebody wrote in the bathroom wall, Dusty is an easy street. I don't think they meant it the way you just thought it. But it's very interesting because when I started at KMPX as a chick engineer, I knew nothing about engineering. You know, so I just kind of went in there. I told Tom Donahue my name was Dusty Street, which it actually is, and I don't know. And he hired me. He said, "You have a license?" I said, "Sure." I thought he meant drivers. And so it was about 6 months before somebody finally realized I didn't have a license on the wall. And at that point, I went into Paul Boucher and I said, "What's a license and where do I get one?" And he said, "Oh, you go down to Radio Shack or whatever the equivalent was, and he said you fill out this form." And I did. I passed it, but only to be a dash engineer. Yeah, Western. I could have worked at Western Union, but I had no broadcast endorsement, so I had to work for a little while longer before I could figure out how to get that one. But it was nice enough of Tom to start a chick engineer show because they were always clamoring to get on the air. And I think that's where Tom first figured out that I actually could do a radio show. So when we came over to KSAN after the strike, I was there engineering for Vaco Kesh. I had been with him doing some recording in the studio with people like Harvey Mandel and Blue Cheer. Oh God, my ears are still ringing. So Vaco got completely messed up at a particular wedding, and he said to Tom, "I can't do my show." So Tom said, "Well, Dusty, you do it, because you've been his engineer all this time." So that's how I got my job on the air. And it was interesting because of the fact that I was the only woman on the air anywhere on the West Coast, actually pretty much anywhere in the country, with maybe one or two exceptions. I think maybe Allison Steele was on WNEW at that time. And I know there was a lovely lady named Yvonne Daniels in Chicago. But the only person on the air here in San Francisco was, anybody remember Gail Garnett will sing in the sunshine? Well, she was Mother Coy's. She had the all-night show. Yes. And so, as far as I knew, that was the only female that I had to look to as to what to be like on the air. And I thought, oh, hell no, not me. And so, fortunately, I had Tom Donahue, Vaco, and Bobby Dale, who taught me how to do radio. And that's, I think, one of those. Can you imagine 3 of those guys teaching you how to do anything? But that's where, Tom was brave enough to hire me. Vaco was brave enough to take me into the studio and teach me how to hear, as well as a deep love for the history of music. And Bobby Dale, without ever knowing it, taught me how to talk on the radio. He taught me how to be my own self. I always loved listening to Bobby talk to himself on the air. It's like he would say something and he'd say, "Yeah, Bobby, did you hear that?" And it's like, wow. And so it gave me that, it gave me the ability to relax enough to think that I was talking to my friends in my living room, because let's face it, we were all loaded most of the time anyway, and whether there were people in my living room or not, I was still talking. So it all worked out really well. That was probably what the whole KSAN experience was, is the fact that we pretty much invented ourselves, and we pretty much invented the way we wanted to do radio right then and there. And if it weren't for the guidance of Tom Donahue, and I mean guidance by the fact that he hired people that he believed in, and then he let us do our job. Yes. Or he let us figure out how to do our job. I remember he gave back one of my record lists, one of my playlists once, because we always wrote down what we played. And he circled the 1 or 2 Led Zeppelin or rock and roll songs that I played, and he wrote a little note under it, "Please play more rock and roll."
Thank you, Dusty. She has. She still does. All right. Richard was next, chronologically, I think, to KSAN, 1969. And like Street, you came in, I think, with no radio experience.
Exactly. Actually, I started practicing. I got a job. Then I was like you. I was working at San Francisco State. I was in the radio department. I got a job producing KNEW talk radio shows over at Jack London Square. But I used to go and hang out and watch Dusty be Tom Donahue's engineer. In fact, one of the coolest things was when Tom interviewed Eric Burden from Eric Burden and the Animals, and I couldn't understand a word. And Street's on the other side of the glass doing the engineering. Tom's interviewing Eric Burden, and he had the thickest Northern English accent. I don't know how anybody could understand it, but that's what I did. I used to go hang out in the evenings and sit on the floor and just watch, listen. I listened at home, but when you were in the studio, to watch both Tom Donahue and Tony Pigg, the way they moved inside the control room to get their music, to form their phrasing, to emphasize words, all that was a learning experience. So I got to do that too, and I actually grew up on KSAN, though I did get a part-time job at KNEW. I used to go, Tom would say, "Go practice." I'd go in the back studio at KNEW and use a turntable so I could make segues. Then I started working at KRTG in San Francisco State.
Yep.
And then when they all moved over there was a time when I got a part-time job, and then when Tony Pig left, I got to work full-time. But I really got to learn on the job without actually being on the job, just being there night after night, and they allowed me to do that. So that
Being
was
there.
cool.
So one of Tom Donahue's geniuses was his ability to mix professionals. He had Tony Pig, Tony Big on KOIA, Tony Pig later in life, and Ed Hepp, Ed Mitchell from KFRC went underground, and then kids from the street, women who impressed him.
We were the youngest people
Yeah.
there. Everybody else were professional radio people, which we got to suck some of the genius out of watching and listening to them.
Yeah.
And that's how I became the way I was, and I'm sure you
That's
too.
how I became
And
the
Bonnie,
way I
I mean, all of us, we had this senior staff
Yes,
who were kind of renegades from the normal media.
mainstream,
Yeah, and it was so beautiful that it was so small that you were able to get in there and do that.
And they were nice to you. I mean, they were not
Sometimes.
protecting their jobs. Bonnie came in from the outside office.
They were. I mean, come on.
No,
They
they
could have
always-
easily sent us flying.
Oh, yeah.
Bonnie began by, you had friendships within the station, so you began hanging out at the station at KSAN, correct?
Yeah, and all of us, you know, it resonated with me just listening to Richard talking about watching Dusty and Donahue. For me, I guess it was Vaco.
Yeah.
You know, that was the first person that I started hanging out at his feet and learning about listening to records and music. And
Vaco was a magician.
he was absolutely a musical magician.
Oh, can I break here for a second?
Monty the
Just
Inspector.
because we have both, we've all mentioned, a number of us have mentioned Vaco. Can we have that Vaco station ID, just to set the mood? Number one, I think.
You people in corporate broadcasting are probably saying, what in the hell was that?
A little different from the Drake jingle.
Yeah.
It was also stereo, because we were FM stereo. I don't need a microphone.
Play over the
So you could watch the VU meters going back and forth, like that Pink Floyd song.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we did, watch the meter and go, wow, isn't that cool?
Bonnie, now, friendships, hanging out, led to a job, but not without having to pass an astrological test. Do you mind telling a bit of that?
Oh, shucks. Sure. I had spent some time, I got to know Dusty and Luther Green, who's also with us today, and my ex-husband Bob Simmons was doing some work around and at KSAN too at the time. And I had, after working for, I started in the Bay Area. My first job was with a fellow named Olin Harrison, who ran sort of a legendary record one-stop and record store south of Market called Advanced Music. And I got quite an education, particularly in 50s and 60s R&B by working at his distributorship with a lot of the black R&B mom and pop stores in the Bay Area. And then I started working doing something called special orders. I don't know if you guys remember this, but we all pretty much lived in a world where at one time you could hear a record and decide that you wanted to copy the album, so you would call your local record store and you would ask them to order it for you, and then they would call a distributor. The distributor would find the record wherever it was in the world, get it to the record store, and then the record store would call you and tell you your record was in. I know this all sounds a little peculiar, but that is how we all lived back in the day. And I was the person who, at a distributor, did all the special orders for records, so I knew how to find all these crazy arcane albums wherever there might be in the world. And Dusty became, well, first I applied at KSAN when Tony Pig was music director. And I went all through the interview process, and then Pig told me that he wasn't able to give me the job because he felt that the only right thing to do in having a record librarian was to hire a Virgo, because they were very detailed. Oh, no, that's true.
No, I remember.
And it wasn't until Dusty became music director, all the full-time jocks would take a shift kind of as music director for 6 months or so. And Dusty became music director, and she knew that I knew how to find records. And so I was able to get my first job at KSAN as record librarian and public service director.
And you went on from there. Scoop.
Yeah.
I don't know this about you. I don't think you had any training as a broadcast journalist when you ambled into KSAN for the first time. But I remember that before KSAN at KMPX, Tom Donahue laid down the law in a PD memo. The air staff should stay away from political commentary and news. He said, the music is sufficient to speak for us. Things had changed apparently by the time you wandered the halls. How did that happen, Scoop?
Well, let me just begin by saying that I have a little raw throat here, but so I apologize for that. Also, I thought you had to die before you became a legend, so I'm really surprised that.
I know, son of a bitch, are you dead here?
No. When I came up to Donahue in '68, I had been a morning disc jockey on the weekends at a radio station for the University of Minnesota, but not really, I didn't really have radio experience. And I said, you're doing all this incredibly great music, but the disc jockeys are just ripping the wire services and reading the headlines. You should be offering your listeners some different kind of news, some different slants on the news, like satire, He said, well, all right, why don't you come in next week and start doing it? literally walked off the street into this position. I did the news with Stefan Bonnick for a while. We did, kind of standard characters and doing some satire. And then he became program director, and I became news director, and I was all alone doing the news. So I started putting these collages together and splicing and dicing up the politicians' speeches.
What inspired that idea of taking pieces of audio, and not just from current news, but from everywhere, cartoons probably, comedy albums, real people on the streets, and mixing it into your version of the news?
How did that happen?
Yeah.
I don't know. I was inspired by the Lord. I don't know. You asked earlier, your first question. What was that? And it was such a mixture of events and moments in history. There was a war. There was a counterculture that was pretty unified in its opposition to the war and in its cultural, trappings and its behavior. And there was this music that kind of solidified that whole counterculture, that whole young, revolution. All those things coming together created KSAN, and I don't think, the conditions had to be right. And the music, I used to say, the music is the news, and the news is the music. And they fed each other, and they created. They not only were we were not only the voice of the counterculture, we created the counterculture. I remember I was interested always in spiritual matters. So I would interview all these gurus who started coming through town every week in 1968, 69. All these famous Indian teachers and spiritual masters, and I got to interview them all. I feel so privileged to have been there at that moment in history. It was what a gift.
They were your rock stars, the spiritual leaders.
No, the rock stars were my rock stars.
I mentioned Terry as having come from two different worlds, but so did Norman Davis. when he joined, he was next in line to join KSAN. He had come from traditional radio, I mean wonderful Kobe, KYA 1260, Boss of the Bay, doing requests and dedications at night. And then given permission to use their real name, finally, Norman Davis, and now KSAN. So what was that transition like for you?
I was one of the very few people that had previous radio experience
Right.
working at KSAN. And I guess I'd been in the business about 15 years. I was hooked on radio from the time I was about 3, and we used to gather around the radio. That was before television, and we'd watch that little glowing dial and listen to the Aldrich family or Fibber McGee and Molly. And those were family moments, and I just thought it was magic. And I still think radio is magic, although there aren't very many practitioners of magic anymore.
Amen.
But it was a smooth ride for you, gliding into KSAN and being let loose in terms of music, production. You grew to become production director. You produced long-form specials or co-produced them with Rick Sadel and others. Was it interesting to run into management that said, yeah, sure, take a whole weekend for a special?
Well, what I learned at KSAN was that when you take the shackles off and you let people do whatever they want to and you give them freedom, there's an immense amount of energy comes with that. And so once Tom O'Hare was really responsible for getting me at KSAN. He and I became friends on my first underground station, which was KZEL up in Eugene, and where I met Tom. And he wanted to get me on KSAN, and eventually that happened. But the creative factor, it was like a fountain that you didn't have to pump to come up with ideas. They were just right there all the time. And it was easy because we had freedom to do that.
Terry McGovern.
What?
Morning man wakes up. Whoa. So, you came from KSFO, big band standards, personality, Don Sherwood. At one point, you were probably considered to be the next Sherwood, and instead you were the next McGovern. And you came in at a time, not too long after, in the 60s, early 70s, the morning show on an underground free-form progressive station was an area where your demo was considered to be still asleep. People woke up at noon, and yet you marched in there and did your show the way you wanted to, and you brought in comedy. You revolutionized mornings on FM. What was your thinking, if any went into it?
What were you thinking?
What the hell? What was that?
What was that? First of all, I want to say that I look out and I know a lot of you people who were not at KSAN and perhaps never were KSAN listeners, and you're looking at us going, who the hell are these people? I cannot answer that for you. I don't know who these people are, but there are a couple of people. I mean, I love them, but where they came from, I have no idea. From Mars, I believe, Ern Morgan, right there. From Venus, of course, Linda Fetter.
Peter Lawfer in front?
Glenn Lambert and his wife Martha, right? Yep. And no, forget him. The most magnificent person in the room, in many ways to me, is Susan, your daughter. She is just what a job, Susie Davis. She did it last night. We come around to Luther Green, who gave me my first porno job.
And he was good, too.
Last month it was, actually.
It's just last month. Believe me, I had a stunt double for that. No, I did a voice. Luther called me and said, hey, Dusty tells me you do a John Wayne voice. I said, well, kind of, yeah. He said, well, come on down here. I'll give you $100. I think it was so I came down to the studio. And it was this speech by, on the screen, monkeys. We're landing a spaceship, and the captain of the monkeys talked like John Wayne. And then it was a full-on porno movie from there on out. Sodom and Gomorrah, Mitchell Brothers. Ah, the days. But as we come back around here, a young man, he's always been a kid to me, but he's become a very successful producer in many, many ways. Fred Green, right here.
We're going to go around the entire room now.
Because this is my time. I'll make it quick. I promise I'll make it quick. The great Dr. Hip. On top of suddenly working at a radio station that had a drug report every day. Oh, and by the way, I got a call. Lay off the brown acid that's going around. Was this guy, Dr. Hip. I couldn't believe the people that were on this air. And then, of course, this is one of my great friends and co-conspirators in crime, Rabbi Lawford here. Anyway, that's it. So here's what happened. I was, y'all, now this is for everybody now because we're talking about the great Don Sherwood. He got hired back to KSFO in '74, and he set the station afire. He just burned it down, and kept only me and Gene Nelson. What we had in common, I had no idea. But Gene and I remained, and I got bored. And then one day, a bunch of naked people appeared in our hallway.
That is correct.
At the Fairmont Hotel.
Yes, we were.
Greek. Her body. Oh, and they ran up and down, and unfortunately O'Hara was also naked.
No.
But aside from that, I said, this is the freaking circus. I want to play there. And one thing led to another, and I met with Tom in Mexico, Molly and I, and he said, I want to hire you because you're good at middle of the road, and we're just a different road. I don't know what he meant. But he had this mechanism in him that said, always stir the pot, always cause things to change. And for weeks after that, years actually, I got hate mail from people who thought I got Stefan Ponig fired. Stefan forgave me years later. But the fact of the matter was, he was a pot disturber, if you know what I mean. He liked to stir it. And he came up, this thing, please, if there's anybody in management in this room, probably not. This is mostly talent and sales, I understand. But Tom Donahue and Gene Autry had the same broadcasting philosophy. Hire them and let them the fuck alone. You couldn't sell that to a radio management person, corporate manager, and they would think you're insane. I remember a guy from KFOG in the 90s caught me at a party and said, I understand you guys played whatever you wanted. You know that's bullshit. I heard that whole legend stuff, yeah. But it was true. And we got to operate the way we wanted to operate, and I had the best time in broadcasting in my life. Yeah. I have never, ever experienced anything like this. She was my boss. Imagine. My favorite DJ in the world. Did you hear that voice? Richard Dawson. Yeah. I worked with Norman from KSFO. Scoop Nisker, I only got to play his news shows on the tape, but I got to work with the two best newsmen in the history of, with all due respect, Dave McQueen and the indomitable Larry Lee. Cronkite, Volkov, forget about it. Larry Lee was absolutely the best newsman I ever heard. Okay, so I know I got 10 seconds.
Carrie.
No, wait a minute. Wait, 10 seconds. I want to, or I'll forget. Oh, and Dusty is the reason I am here today because she got me hired at KSAN. Brought me in, sold me to Tom Donahue, and on the morning of my first show, she stood on the other side of that old Gates board in the blue toilet, we called it, the studio.
Yes.
She stood on the other side of that. I said, I can't believe this. I've been doing radio. I'm nervous. She said, as I started my first record, she said, have a great show. Dusty Street. Thank you.
All right. Come down. Street, is that true?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I flashed every single one of these sons of bitches.
She loved you. She really loved you.
Oh, honey, I just didn't want to embarrass you.
Us weekend guys missed out, apparently. I got flashed by O'Hare.
Can I just break in with since you used the title of the KSAN 10th anniversary special. It actually had two titles. One was Suddenly Lost Summer,
Yes.
and then the subtitle was What Was That? Just with the genesis of What Was That. I don't know if you've ever heard
You
it.
gonna tell the story behind it?
Well, it's a little story, actually. It came from Donahue, and he had a partner when he was at KYA named Bobby Mitchell, that some of you probably remember, quite an extraordinary disc jockey himself.
Here to clear up your face and blow your mind.
Funny guy. And Bobby, unfortunately, was very ill for some time, and What Was That is what Donahue always claimed were Bobby Mitchell's last words.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
That he sat up in bed at the very moments before he went and said, "What was that?"
Words to die by.
I'm not sure if got around to them, but Buzzy and Dee Dee Donahue are here.
Oh,
There they are. And speaking of what was that style of KSAN announcing? The laid back, free form,
It's called marijuana.
personified. Yeah, good street. Yeah, Richard, can you address that? What was that?
It was really like that. It was so, you know, actually, Ben, it was anti top 40. I
Yeah.
mean, everyone else was blah, 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 and so we were real cool. And but you know, in the beginning, what? Waterbed commercials, Lost Dogs. We did a lot of voice. We didn't have a lot of produced spots,
Yeah.
and so
Right.
everything. Yeah, but you're right. It was a style, and I picked mine up from Tom and Tony Pig. Though they were both top 40 disc jockeys, they had the slower delivery.
Yeah.
And a little lower, not up here,
Right.
like I can talk both, but yeah, I was shy,
Yeah.
because I wasn't, like Terry, I wasn't in the theatrical biz. I was a student at San Francisco State who loved music, what can I say? And smoked a lot of weed too.
Yeah.
And by the way, that does not cure glaucoma, because I do have glaucoma. Just a little side thing.
All those years downstairs at the.
Doesn't do it.
Hey, can I say one quick thing? First of all, he was
Okay to your life.
Really?
You say that to all of us.
No, because I used to do a bit about him in stand-up. But I wanted to just say one quick thing. Last night, Norman Orr, among other wonderful people, were at the concert.
Get on the mic, Terry.
Oh,
Get on the mic, Terry.
Radio.
is this thing on? Norman Orr, I believe is his name. He's the artist that did many of the posters before I even got there. And I still have it in my John in my studio, is the one where it looks like a radio, and all of the jocks are in there. And it's very, very well drawn. But the thing that, when you look at it, this is what KSAN was, because you have this radio with all the jocks drawn in there. But then, over the top, in a very sort of ephemeral style, are all the artists, Hendrix and Joplin. And it was a testimony and an explanation of exactly what KSAN was. Crazy people, all different, everybody different, but all of us paying homage and playing with great love the music of the era. That was number one, as Tom said.
I think talking about the style of announcing, we can also say and pay credit to the jazz announcers.
Yeah.
We have here in the Bay Area on the K-Jazz, of course, out of Alameda, and other stations. They were conversational, they were lucid, they were hip, they explained the music and the musicians. And I think that was appreciated by us who were lucky enough to hear jazz radio. And I think that kind of filtered down to what we were doing. I know I learned from Richard and Stefan in terms of my own fake style. Yes,
I want to say something really quick. The other thing too is, when I talked about Bobby Dale teaching me, unbeknownst to him, about how to speak, is that Bobby was always, I got from Bobby that you were always talking to your best friends in your living room. And you never yelled at your, I mean, how do you talk to your best friends in your living room? And so that pretty much became the style, you know, is that that's how you were communicating. It was not that you were trying to be, you know, this, whatever it was. And I never regarded myself as a disc jockey in that particular vein, because I always thought that my talent was the music. And I always thought that if I got on the mic to talk, It was just to give the information about the music, but the music was what was important.
You were
You know.
encyclopedic about it.
Yeah, but
Well,
Dusty,
thank
you talked like I did. We talked through our music.
Yeah.
So you could do 20-minute sets easily without coming out. And modern radio or commercial radio hated that.
Mm.
You didn't want you in every, no segues.
Yeah.
There's got to be a call letter in there. We were able to do that. Could run around the corner to the financial corner and get a couple of bids.
I was going to say, we were also really lazy and we didn't want to talk that much during the course of the
Or no, the
night.
background.
Yeah,
Long
but
cut.
no, Dusty, we talked through our music more.
Yeah.
And then later, as KSAN evolved, we did become a tighter station. We did have to talk.
But Richard, this advantage you just spoke about led to your demise. You went to the financial corner and you would get a couple of shots, a beer and something else, bring it back to the studio during a long set or a long track, and then you would do your show. But then one time you went in there and there's some people around there who saw you, like the bosses.
Yeah, well, I made sure they saw me. It was David Moorhead, and the people from LA had come up to take over KSAN, and I was about ready to leave anyway. Things had changed a lot, and so I didn't. Normally, I would have hidden that. I would have gone over when everyone was around, got my 2 beers to go back to the station, had another shot. But I decided to, hey, hi everybody, and I'm going back to work. They considered us, which I thought was a compliment, Dusty, and they called us the art farm on the West Coast. Remember, Metro Media thought of us as the art farm on the West Coast.
Wow.
And I thought, cool.
This
But
is
they-
a man who had the management skills of the commandant of Treblinka.
We called him nuclear warhead for a reason.
Right, L nuclear warhead.
Norman, in your scrapbook, I said you would actually include your letter of termination from KSAN. Why were you fired this last time?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, why were you fired from KSAN the last time?
There was a time in the late 70s when our ratings started to slip for various reasons. One was Camel, one was some competition, and the other was a change of management who had maybe some different ideas on how to do things. And what was the question?
I can ask another question about why were you
I got it.
I think if we jot it down for you.
No, what happened was there was a big staff meeting, and that's when Abby Malema, the new program director.
No, it wasn't.
No.
All right.
It was not.
No. And anyway, they explained to us in this meeting how they were going to help us improve the sound of the station and the ratings by giving us specific tracks to play from various albums. Yeah, and I don't know, I should have just shut my mouth and kept on doing what I was doing, but I stood up and said, that's not what I was hired to do, and I'm not going to do
I
it.
remember the meeting. Jerry Grant.
And I got a notice a couple, 3 days later that I was terminated.
Scoot, what was the impact on the news side in terms of the changes of fortunes for KSAN? Did they begin to downsize the news coverage, for example, or cut down the staff?
Well, they cut me down. I guess it was 1969. The San Francisco Examiner accused me of being the voice of the rioters who went on a rampage after the Chicago conspiracy trial verdict came in. And they said that people were listening to me, telling them where to go to break windows and create havoc. I would love to have taken credit, but I don't think I was the voice. Anyway, they told me, they didn't fire me. They told me I could stay and keep doing the newscasts, but I had to take all the rock and roll out from under it. I had to stop doing the collages, which were very emotional and filled with, kind of fiery rhetoric and stuff. And that's, so I took the opportunity to go to India, which I had been dying to do anyway, and I left. But I remember protests. I was really proud that people came down and protested outside the station.
Yeah.
Wow. I must admit, I still have dreams about KSAN. Usually about going into the studio, no records on any turntable.
Nothing works.
Bonnie Simmons.
We
in the
all
record
have that
library.
dream, I'm afraid,
No
that
records in the record
nightmare.
library, only one Congress of Wonders.
With pigeons in the park.
Same way that.
Mine had just one ABBA album in it.
I
never had an ABBA album.
Sentimentally, emotionally, what was it like to take leave of KSAN, even though you've continued in many cases in radio or in media? What was it like, Dusty, for you to say goodbye to KSAN?
Well, I didn't say goodbye to KSAN in that regard. I walked out on KSAN in about '74. God only knows why. And I had encountered what happened at KSAN in other radio stations as I went through my KSFX and KTIM. Slowly but surely, what happens, it was like this huge flushing sound, you know? Everything creative, everything that had any kind of energy, anything that actually communicated with your audience on a level other than the lowest common denominator was being flushed out of radio. I work for Sirius XM now, and I have been told that they love my stories but keep them to 30 seconds. And this is exactly how I felt when the corporations and the consultants came in and decided that they were going to tell us how to do what we had been successful at. And a very interesting thing happened. When corporations and consultants started telling us how to do it successfully, the ratings in every single radio station that had anything to do with great ratings slowly and surely just dropped down into the basement. Whereas what would be, we could be pulling something like 15 point somethings back in the heyday. Now if you're pulling a 3.9, you're considered a huge success. So it didn't happen just at KSAN, it happened to all of us that were creative in FM stations across the country. And it will never recover, unfortunately. Thank God I was a part of it when it was here.
That's right. Thank God we're Dusty. Do you still think a lot about those times and what you left behind?
You know, I suppose I do from time to time, but I have had so much fun since then. I just,
In all
you know,
areas.
I gotta say I am one lucky dog.
You are.
I have had so many jobs that have been really pretty inspiring to me and kept me going. And come on, I'm 65 years old, and right now I get to work with the Bill Graham Foundation and for 13 years with Hardly Strictly Bluegrass, and you know that does not suck. So
Yeah,
so
doesn't suck.
I don't. And I gotta say that in one way or another, I have done some radio since then
Yes.
that I found at least partially fulfilling, although on the other hand, there is nothing that even compares to KSAN
Right.
and what that experience was like. And I'm not sure that any of us can even explain it. You know, a lot of it had to do with the fact that I came there was 19 years old, you know, and a lot of us started when we were pretty young there. And if you think about being 19 and it's 1970 and we're in San Francisco and we're at a radio station, which all of you who have done radio know that there is this weird thing about radio, that it just draws people to it. You know, whether it's because of large amounts of electricity, I don't know what it is, but you know, the strangest people in the world end up in radio stations in one way or another. It was just, there's nothing to compare to it.
I understand.
Radio.
And you know what, I stayed away actually from San Francisco for a while. I went to Warner Brothers and I was doing the whole country, doing promotion. And I found that it was really hard for me to come to San Francisco to do my job because I would have had to, okay, if you really want to know, I came to KSAN a few months after I left, and I came there and they had just painted the building on Sansom Street. And was kind of this weird, bright, kind of orangey, brown, green thing. And I just made an offhand comment, you know, about how the paint job was kind of bright. And the new person that was the program director said, those have always been KSAN's colors. I thought, wow, I had no idea.
News to us.
But that kind of passed, and I just look at it all pretty dang fondly.
Yep. All right.
You know, when we had that reunion at KUSF some
Yes.
years, you know, I'm sure we're all pretty passionate people that were at KSAN, and there was lots of tumultuous activity at KSAN, and I'm sure that some of us came away from KSAN with some resentments or some, you know, there was some kind of bickering or attitudes among us, as there always are when you have any group of very outspoken people who have gone through some, you know, crazy ride together. But when we got to KUSF for the reunion, I remember that nobody could remember what they were mad at each other for. You know, I think you just have to wait about 10 years, and then everybody, it all sort of mellows out.
The veil of time.
Enough babbling.
We checked, Richard already told about his departure with 2 shots. So let's, we have to wrap things up, so let's let McGovern wrap things up.
With what?
The answer to what was that?
I have
No, your departure, you, like Bonnie, and like many of us, you worked in other media after KSAN.
You don't want me to do the song?
But does radio still resonate with you? Do you still think back sometimes to that moment of that particular radio station among all the ones you worked at?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes. And now we come full circle, KSAN, the Bay Area Radio Hall of Fame, because of these people and people in this room. Congratulations.
Thank you, broadcast legends. Thank you guys so much. You men and women, thank you.